On July 19th, 2024, CrowdStrike made everybody understand the impact of the blue screen of death. Well, what does that mean to AV? What should we know as programmers? And how does that impact how we act as an industry? All that and more on A State of Control. A State of Control, episode 120. CrowdStrike, What Went Wrong? Welcome to A State of Control, an AVNation podcast that highlights the control programming and automation aspects of the audiovisual industry. My name is Steve Greenblatt. I'm your host. Thanks for joining us today. So from time to time, we talk about some current events. And today we're going to talk about something that should be familiar to everybody, and that is the CrowdStrike incident that happened in July of 2024. If you're listening to this in the future, you may recall, but it's something that did impact a lot of people, and it also has a lot of relevance to the AV industry, and we'll be talking about that today. And we have two guests to join us. One is returning and one is new. And before I get to say hello to them, I'm going to welcome and say hello to my partner and friend, Rich Fregosa. Uncle Richie, how are you?
I'm doing good, buddy. We're T-minus a couple of weeks from this recording to seeing each other in the real time.
Absolutely. Always a good time. Family dinner is always a can't miss event. So looking forward to that. Let's move on and say hi to another familiar face to me and somebody who I host a podcast with called Ask the Programmer. He's James King, and he is from the School of Medicine at UNLV. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here with Uncle Richie and you, and I love this topic.
Absolutely. And James was last with us on episode 105. And so if you want to hear some more about James, and he's been with us for several episodes, but that was the most recent one. Last but not least, somebody who's not new to AVNation, but is new to this podcast, somebody I've gotten to know over the past few months a little bit better, but I've known him for some time, and he's got a lot of great things to talk about in cybersecurity and IT and AV. And he's Paul Konikowski, and he's an AV veteran. And welcome, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Steve. I appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for being here. So as I mentioned in the opening, on July 19th, 2024, a lot of us were reminded about our dependency on computers and technology. And we woke up that morning to a big panic where a term that we all know as the blue screen of death became a common term to just about everybody in the world. And what happened was there was an update that it impacted a lot of Windows machines and a lot of systems by a company called CrowdStrike that really took down the world, if you will. It impacted businesses and transportation and industries. And while we were able to recover, it still made us aware of how important it is to vet and have an implementation and a backup plan for software. So, Rich, with that said, we here have been in this this really niche industry of AV that kind of been making the rules as we go for the most part, and things have been going quite well. But it is a time for us to become a lot more serious about doing updates and the responsibilities that get involved with that.
What was interesting to me about CrowdStrike and kind of the aftermath, and like I found out about it because I was in the middle of something and all of a sudden all heck broke loose with systems. But when they started doing the postmortem and they started tracking down what the issues were, one of the theories is that they basically made an update to the code base without vetting it properly, and it was a typo. And anybody who does what we do from a control systems programming standpoint, first thing we talk about is checking your work and vetting your work and regression testing and like considering anything that you do once you're maintaining, what the repercussions are as you're changing it. We talk about best software practice. This was a perfect example of the next level of why you do this in the first place. We have local isolated issues. This was worldwide. The concept, though, and the mistake was still the same. It was, it was kind of a computer science 101 that everybody went, whoops, because they got complacent, for whatever reason. Why? Because you needed to get it done. You were over budget. Somebody was telling you that they need it now, even though you're pushing back saying it's not ready, and they say do it anyway, right? These are all familiar conversations that we have in our industry, and other industries are not immune to it. And so I view it as an important lesson, as a safe lesson for us, because to go, look, if you had thousands of people over there who were doing this and collaborating and everything else, and they didn't stick to the basics, because that's what it came down to, is that you sometimes believe your own press, and in the act of getting things done, you get away from your fundamentals. And once you get away from your fundamentals because you think you're either too good for it or you don't have time for fundamentals, this is an example of something that happened. So, it was nuts. I mean, again, it was just watching dominoes go, at that point, because every time I turned around, there was something new that went down, and it literally, it trickled. It was, the first thought was like, oh man, there's a virus that's coming through, because it acted like one, right? It just spread along the way. But, again, we use these things as a lesson. I hope we use them as lessons. I know I did, because it also prompts the conversation to go back and go, do I even know what I'm using if it's susceptible to it? I found out that my remote diagnostic software, done. All of the major carriers got taken out. So my ability to even assess a problem on a site disappeared and was affected, and now I'm making plans going, how do I get to 4 different sites that are 3 hours in 3 different directions? That's where it affects you in terms of our industry. So, it was nutty. It was a first. It was definitely a first.
Absolutely. Yeah. James, we often talk about how AV, it's not life and death. You work in a medical school, it could be a little different. But let's, kind of playing on what Rich said, what are our responsibilities and to ensure that our systems and, that we take doing updates a little bit more seriously, and that our systems are more resilient?
Our main responsibility, besides testing and vetting our code, we always say we test and vet our code, but it's sometimes, like Richie said, sometimes you get that pressure from higher up that pushes us. But the thing is, I actually heard this on a leadership podcast. It is our job to challenge leadership. Sometimes, if you are not 100% sure in your code, you have not gone through the vetting process, and your leadership is coming down and saying, push it out now, you will have to push back and say, no, this could potentially take down thousands of clients, or hey, take down one room. Like we're talking about AV. There's a potential of being an issue. Give me the time to properly vet this. Say, let's put the time up front to vet and verify before we have to do a knee-jerk reaction. Going to what Richie also said, there was a lot of knee-jerk reaction to the CrowdStrike because everyone thought it was a cyber attack or a virus hitting globally. Us IT folks, us AV folks, we sit there and go, hold on, pump the brakes. What's actually happening? And then get to all the data and the facts first, and then assess and move forward. You can't just knee-jerk react like a lot of people was doing, especially during this. Everyone's like, "Hey, our country's getting attacked. We're cybersecurity. Hey, we're vulnerable." But, left and right, throw doomsday things out there. Yeah, there was issues, but it was not doomsday. So as we take on that leadership and challenge them, we can do better. Like the podcast is talking about, this really came from pilots. Like your main pilot is supposed to control, landing gear, speed, all that stuff. Well, it's also the job of the co-pilot, if the pilot is not doing their job properly, to challenge the pilot. You know what? They got thousands of lives to worry about. So they'll be like, hey, we should be putting the gear down at this time. Should I put the gear at this time? Oh, I missed the mark. I'm putting the gear down at this time. Like, they'll actually supersede the pilot if they feel they need to.
Yeah, I think one of the best rumors that I heard during that day, because there was a lot of rumors going around, like you said, a lot of misinformation, and some people put out a quick patch. Here's how you fix it if you can get in there. But the best one I heard was, reboot your computer 15 times, and that should do it. I don't know if you guys saw that. It was somewhere on Twitter or something, and it's like, and we all know that, sometimes rebooting 2 or 3 times might do something, but chances are those next 12 aren't doing anything, and that person just happened to reboot at the same, that 15th time. And so I can just imagine how many people are out there trying to reboot 15 or 16 times, losing count. How many, so we do have to watch that misinformation and how we react. Getting back to what you said earlier, in terms of testing, and how this isn't all that different from our world, right? Like our world, we do try to stage equipment, right, before it goes out, but you can't get everything necessarily unless it's a brand new system. There's always something in the office environment that you're putting into that you're not gonna be able to test. And this was like a kernel update, and so I don't know the full details of it, but in terms of their testing, did they really test hardware, or did they test like virtual machines? Did they test it in that sort of environment, and did they test it on all different types of machines? Not likely, not likely. They probably did some level of testing and checked the box and said, yep, we're ready to roll, and didn't quite test it right. But yeah, I mean, I agree with James in terms of questioning, being the one that stops and says, hey, this isn't ready, or we need to test it more. I mean, I'm a big fan of questioning authority, so I'm on board with that. But yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon for AV. That's the thing, is we've all seen the updates come in that if you do a firmware update on something, suddenly your control system doesn't work, right? That's the fear oftentimes that I've heard traditionally, is the reason not to upgrade any firmware is, well, if you do, it may not work anymore. You guys are all nodding your heads because you're the programmers here, right? So let's just say, how do you juggle that in AV? Let's start there. Like, how do you test it before you update the firmware? Are you actually doing that, or are you just crossing your fingers?
Paul, I think you brought up a good point, and it contradicts my theories. We all heard this saying, if it's not broke, don't break it. Like, don't update something if it's working. I want to say it was Southwest. I'm not 100% sure, but one of the smaller big airlines is still running on like XP or 98. I don't know.
Yeah, I heard 3.1. Yeah, Windows 3.1 was. I don't know if that's really true. I don't know if that's true, but
they were not
heard,
impacted.
yeah.
They weren't, because they weren't on the latest, so they can still function. But you know what? How accessible are they to other issues? Because they're not updating. So I agree. Like, this is a win for that. Hey, don't update if it's not broke situation. But I also say, we update things. We don't update things for fun. We update them for a reason: security, new features, new options. So we have to test it. We have to vet. Like, I'm a big component of a sandbox environment. Give you a environment that as close as you can to production and test. Like you said, Paul, you're not going to get everything. You're going to miss things. Like, for example, we're vetting right now Windows 11 in our environment. I had to pick 3 different spaces to try Windows 11 in, because they're all a little different. So I was like, I want to see what happens if I put in A, B, and C, instead of blowing it out to the whole campus and then be like, oh no, it didn't work in room B style.
Paul, I'll throw it back to you, and because Rich brought this up in the beginning, is that the programmers were under the gun. They needed to get it out. Sounds very familiar to AV. How often are we trying to either make unrealistic deadlines or trying to do more with less? Is it time for us to start to grow up a little bit and put more requirements into projects that allow the time to do things a little bit more thoroughly and have true test plans and update strategies in our projects and systems?
Well, let's just start with the time aspect. Like you're saying, you're under the gun, you got to get it done, and we don't have enough time, right? But we all know if you do it wrong, to fix it takes 5 times as long. If you do it right the first time and you go through those checklists, it's a lot less troubleshooting later on. So that's the first thing I'd like to do. We definitely are the type, and I've said this on other channels, that we are the ones, we as an industry are the ones who get it working. That's our goal, is to get the system up and running. Then we go back and sort of do the process that we're supposed to have done. A lot of times we're just happy to get it going. Like we might get the system working, then write the manual, for it. We'll do that. We'll label it later. So instead of doing in the steps, so we're constantly the ones that are trying to get it working. Very rarely, and I wish people would start doing this, is do we think what could go wrong? One of my coworkers said, one of the things I last do when I do a program is I try to break my own program. And he basically pushes random things of buttons, but is that really a proper vetting of the system? Is that a third-party test? And how often do we put on what I call the bad actor hat and say, if I was a malicious actor, what could go wrong here? What can I do? What if I unplug this thing? People are like, well, no one's ever going to unplug it. We all know things have been unplugged, right? You guys have done troubleshooting calls where something got unplugged. So we don't think things are, as AV people, we think it's never going to be unplugged. It's going to be plugged in forever. Of course, there's never going to be a power outage. Like, what? That doesn't happen in our world, because we got up and running and I got to go, I'm going to take off now. So call me a pessimist. I don't mind being called that. I think that actually is one of my strengths, is I can look at something and say, oh, this could go really wrong, and if we start thinking like that about one of the biggest the reason this thing impacted so wide is because so many people were using CrowdStrike. I mean, and if we look at our own industry like that and everyone using the same thing, or, oh, we're going to standardize across this entire campus, and one rollout can take out your entire campus or 80% of your rooms, maybe you shouldn't roll it out to 80%. I think that's the other thing I never really got a clarification on. Maybe you guys did, is why wasn't this rolled out slower, and so that they could have stopped it and at least lessen the impact? Because they said they rolled it out, but I think they rolled it out over about 10 seconds. It feels like, because obviously these things, it took things out like hard. And so a couple of reports of that should have put the brakes on that rollout. So it's one of those things, they said they did it, but did they really roll it out? I don't know if you guys had heard anything about it, or how do you, how do we roll it out as an industry? I think we used to do it room by room, but now we're being encouraged to do it a bigger push, So, can you speak to that at all?
I think you did pretty good there, Paul. That do it later thing. I always love this saying, because, oh, we'll do that later. And then it's like, will you? Put the time in now, because most likely you're not going to have the time later to do it. But I'm like you, Paul. I'm a pessimist. I look at the things, and I actually did that just very recently on a change I need to make for a new system. I had to move a piece of gear on the network from one VLAN to another. And I know a lot of people would be, oh, just move it. But I stop and I'm like, wait, there's multiple rooms that connect to this unit. If I move the VLAN, what will happen to the other rooms? And I had to go through the process in my head. I go, okay, this is what They don't communicate to each other. This is what's going to happen. Okay, if this does happen, what's our plans to make sure the rooms are functional until I can address that concern? So I had all that plan in place, talked to my team saying, we're doing this. This is a potential impact of doing this. Here's the workaround for that impact if it happens. And then I moved the equipment. And yes, it did happen, and we had no hiccups because we were prepared for that worst case. I agree with that whole rollout. I didn't hear about any good rollout for this CrowdStrike, but I agree. I don't think they really vetted that well on the rollout. But that's where you got to do the rollout. You got to find out, like when I do, like what I mentioned earlier, the Windows 11, I'm trying 3 spaces. We're testing, vetting, making sure, and then putting it out to other places. It might go to a floor, or it might go to a building, and then you move on to the next one. You vet and make sure, okay, yeah, nothing broke. Let's move on. And then the one thing I also want to hit with CrowdStrike is this kind of shows an issue I foresee coming with the push to cloud everything. When you put everything into one system, this cloud, hey, you know, my whole campus is going to run on this, or hey, my whole enterprise, you know, even globally, is going to run off of this one cloud server. What if that server goes down? Then you're completely dark in the water, and we've all experienced that. And we saw it with CrowdStrike. They had an issue. They took down a bunch of things that were reliant on them.
Right. And so there's the other thing is, do we have backups? Generally, we don't in AV. You rarely have a backup system. If anything, we have those hybrid things where you have the old codec and then the new codec, you know, and the backup is something you roll in on a cart. So having I don't know if we need to have dual systems, but definitely have a way to back out a change. You know, IT people tend to think if this change doesn't work, how do we get back to where we were and how quickly? And documenting, you know, the old version of the systems, I think is important. And I think anyone that's starting to work with government, I work with government now. I think they're putting out a good amount of literature and guidance on things like the secure supply chain risk management and software bill of materials, which says if you have these components in your chain and something, you know, in your system, this one's found vulnerable, you can identify those vulnerabilities faster in your or you can look before you apply a patch what systems might be affected and which ones won't. You know, which ones are Windows 11, for instance, which ones are not. And, you know, are we doing that in AV? Are we, how much are we starting to download code from a GitHub repository instead of writing it from scratch? I think in the old days, there was a lot more writing from scratch. You know, there was maybe a server or just a hard drive floating around that the local programmers would share. But now you've got GitHub, and I'm going to throw this out there. You know it's coming. AI is going to write all of our code for us now, right? So, you know, if you're just, I got this off AI, hey, it works. Now I can go home. How do we document that? You know, how does 10 years from now, 5 years from now, how does the next programmer know where the code came from? You know, how do we control that ecosystem, you know, the supply chain from chips to code to, you know, any of that. I mean, documentation in general has always been a struggle for AV because it's like, it's working. Here's your cut sheets. You know, I mean, how often do you list what versions of code you have running on your machines? We download the latest, but does anyone track that at all? Or
it's a really good point. I think that's going to be a topic for a future show. So we'll be. I think that's a really good subject. I love that actually, and I'm gonna, because of time, I'm going to put a pause on that. But I want to bring Rich into this conversation because I want him. I'm sure that he's gone through plenty of ups and downs and plenty of crises. Um, when it comes to testing, when it comes to this rollout that we've been talking about, what's the programmer's responsibility? And is it time for there to be maybe a different role, if you will, in the project team for making sure that systems stay up to date and taking the programmer kind of out of the center of focus there?
There's a tough one, and so I'm going to kind of bring up the uncomfortable side of the fact that this is a business, that we're all in business. And when things go wrong, and if you're a new integrator or a new programmer, you don't have this experience necessarily yet, but if you do this long enough, you will face this experience at least once in your career. And it comes to blame. When something goes wrong, depending on what sector you're in, the first thing that they're going to do from the top down is look to assign blame. And as a small company, that can be a company killer. As a larger company, there can be all kinds of things going on. I'll bring up a little story. Years ago, I was working for a bank executive. It was the executive conference room. It was the heads of a large X bank. Conference was going on between multiple sites. Conference went down. They spent a month trying to figure out who was to blame for that going out. Now, the conference controller had this company's name on it. The thing that turns the TVs on and makes the images show up had that name on it. Guess who they went after first, right? Once that starts there and it goes down the road, okay, well, who put this in? What did they do? Did they do something wrong? And it keeps going down and down and down.
It's like a root cause analysis, right? In security land, you keep getting back to what actually caused it. Yeah.
Which again is fine.
And often in AV, they're looking for people. They want to blame a person. I mean, how often have you heard so and so has been blacklisted on a campus because they did a bad job on something, and it's then a couple years later, someone else gets blacklisted and someone else gets blacklisted, and they finally come back around to that first integrator that they said they'd never use again.
Right.
So it's more about, I think, admitting something went wrong, and then how do we fix it, right? How quickly can we fix it? But you're absolutely right. They always look for, like, well, whose fault was this? Instead of just saying this happens.
And that's from a company standpoint. You're asking, how does the programmer get involved in that? You have to learn to communicate that. As a business owner, you have to learn to memorialize it in your agreements and be able to say, look, and again, it comes down, now you're looking at your insurance, right? Now, again, everybody's running a business after CrowdStrike starts looking at their E&O insurance. At least I did, because I'm going, hey, if all of a sudden they said, you were the cause of this, can I make sure that they don't kill my company because of it? And again, you've got different levels of exposure. If you work for a company, a little bit different, but again, your role should be, what's the saying is that I hire professionals because professionals know to ask me the questions I don't know to ask, right? That should be your responsibility. That's your professional responsibility to say, look, whether you say, nah, forget about it or anything else, it's my responsibility to say that we need to consider X, Y, and Z, because this just happened. Do we have a plan? If we don't, and just like Paul was saying, like, how do we address it, right? How do you be proactive? And part of this is not only being reactive, right? I wrote the code, I hit upload, pushed some buttons, and I walked away. I'm good. Great. Again, that's your job. That's what you're paid for. But there's the other side of your career and making sure that you're being thorough and going through the possible. Nobody likes to think about when things go wrong, right? But the first conversation I have with everybody is, look, it is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I've taken as many steps as I believe are reasonable to address when. It may not be perfect. It may not even turn out. There may be something that I haven't considered. but we are making, and again, you're right, best efforts to maintain system reliability. And again, and it's tough because if you're the one who's sitting on the paint bucket typing away trying to get the last thing done, right, because everybody's looking at you saying they need the room in 2 hours or whatever, it's easy to kind of succumb to the pressure. Part of growth, part of becoming a professional, part of becoming a respected professional is the ability to advise and be proactive and protect your clients from themselves. That's a skill, but it's one that on every job you should try to cultivate.
That's probably a good place for us to wrap this one, because I think that's a great point. And I was actually going to mention too, as a small business, we're could be very vulnerable, as you mentioned, to being taken down by something like this, because if the right person wants to take action, they certainly have a lot more power than we do, and there's a liability there. So it's I think it's a great topic, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this some more. I wrote down a couple of ideas of what we can do to spin off of this, and but thank you guys for being part of this and having such a lively discussion. I'm sure that our listeners will appreciate it and be able to relate to a lot of what we discussed. James King from the School of Medicine at UNLV, how can people get in touch with you, learn more about your podcast writing, so forth, and continue the conversation?
If you want to get a hold of me, you can listen to the Ask the Programmer with Steve and I that we pop out weekly. I'm on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days at AV_James King. I'm on LinkedIn, anything with HEPMA, writer for the Higher Ed Digital Magazine. You Google me, you'll find me.
Excellent. And Paul Konikowski, thanks again for being with us. I hope that your first time was a good experience and that you want to come back for more. How can people get in touch with you and keep this conversation going? And as you could tell, Paul's a great wealth of knowledge, so you should get in touch with him.
Well, you look for this hatch, and then you open the hatch, and you go down into my bunker. No, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's usually the best way to get a hold of me. Paul Konikowski. I do work with government, so keeping that a little bit quieter. But you can also find me on the Avixa Exchange. I've recently been made into an advocate, Avixa Exchange advocate, and I encourage these conversations to continue there, cross-platform a little bit. So you can find me on both of those.
Excellent. Thanks for being with us. And Rich, another great episode, another good conversation where we're able to learn some things. How can people get in touch with you and keep this conversation going?
You can find me on the interwebs. You can type in my name or the company name and things will pop up. You can find me on the socials at @rfregosa. I'm also active in the Facebook groups and different programming communities. Reach out, the email, Rich@Fregosa Design. I know Steve and I talk about it a lot. If you take the time to listen, take the time to reach out. It's why we do it, and it means a lot to us, as much because I know sometimes Steve and I sit here and we're, going on 11 years and we enjoy what we do. But it definitely gives us a little lift in our step, knowing that the knowledge that we have is somehow being passed on somewhere. And more importantly, pull up archives of these shows. Paul and James drop some knowledge bombs, of what you really ought to be considering. And, this is why we do it, to bring people who, I love that everybody in this room is smarter than me. That's the best thing for me possible. But first and foremost, obviously, I hope you find us on AVNation.tv and our varied shows that address all of the different verticals in the market, and always support our sponsors.
Absolutely. Well said, Rich. And if you want to be a guest, please reach out to us as well. We're always looking for new guests and fresh ideas. So please join us. And as Paul can attest, it's a good experience, I hope. And we appreciate you being here with us. For me, you can reach me at Steve Greenblatt on social media. My company, Control Concepts, at controlconcepts.net. And we always welcome your feedback, a rating, review, and just let us know you're listening. So with that, this has been A State of Control.
the network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
This is Erin Marmoran of EdTech. The world of higher ed AV is growing rapidly. That's why each month we hear from the best and brightest from colleges and universities all over the U.S. Check out EdTech on avnation.tv or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.